Silent Guests. Chapter 5. Fractures. Ravensmere House no longer felt like the same place. Arthur Pembroke had been dead for less than 3 hours, yet the house seemed to have absorbed the loss, as though it understood something its guests did not. The warmth that had greeted them on arrival still lingered in the polished oak walls and the crackling fireplaces, but it now felt strangely hollow, as though the building itself had been stripped of its purpose. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall appeared louder than before, each measured tick echoing through the silence with almost uncomfortable clarity. Lucy Gilmour remained awake long after everyone had retired. Sleep seemed impossible. She sat in the small armchair beside the bedroom window, wrapped in a blanket she had found folded neatly at the foot of the bed, watching rain drift through the weak glow of the garden lamps below. Beyond the terraces, the sea was invisible once again, swallowed by darkness and mist, though she could hear the waves breaking rhythmically against the rocks beneath the cliffs. Arthur's final conversation replayed endlessly in her thoughts. Stories have to be told in the right order. She had heard countless memorable quotes throughout her career, but few had settled in her mind as stubbornly as those words. The story, the leather folder, the presentation, everything had been leading towards that afternoon. Someone, if Oliver was right to suspect murder, had prevented Arthur from telling it. Why? Lucy leaned forward, resting her elbows upon her knees. The obvious answer was because whatever Arthur intended to reveal threatened someone. But that explanation raised an even larger question. Which someone? She thought back over the previous 24 hours, replaying conversations with each guest. Marcus had been charming, confident, and endlessly talkative, but had revealed surprisingly little about himself. Henry had remained measured throughout every conversation, speaking only when he believed he had something worthwhile to contribute. Andrew had worn his enthusiasm openly, incapable of disguising genuine excitement whenever history entered the conversation. Helen had observed far more than she had volunteered. Neil. Poor Neil. Lucy closed her eyes briefly. She couldn't stop thinking about the expression on his face outside Arthur's study. It hadn't been fear. It had been heartbreak. Then there was Elliot Brooks. She opened her notebook. Without entirely realizing why, she wrote a single sentence. Why photograph Arthur? She stared at the words. Photographers photograph people every day. There was nothing unusual about that. Yet something about Elliot's behavior continued to bother her. Not because he'd taken the photograph, because Arthur had noticed him doing it. And for the briefest moment, something had passed between them. Recognition, concern, understanding. Lucy wasn't sure, only that it hadn't felt ordinary. A sudden knock at the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. 3 quiet taps, nothing more. She crossed the room. Who is it? It's Oliver. She opened the door. Oliver Reid stood in the corridor, still fully dressed, one hand holding a mug of coffee, while the other remained tucked inside the pocket of his jumper. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Lucy smiled faintly. I don't think anyone's sleeping. Oliver returned the smile. I suspected as much. He glanced towards the empty corridor. Would you mind walking? The house after midnight possessed a different atmosphere entirely. Most of the lamps had been extinguished, leaving only small pools of warm light along the corridors and landings. Shadows stretched between portraits and bookcases, while rain continued to whisper steadily against the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Lucy and Oliver walked slowly toward the gallery. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Oliver broke the silence. I wanted your opinion. Lucy looked amused. Arthur said exactly the same thing this morning. I imagine his question was considerably more interesting. It probably was. Oliver looked down into the entrance hall below. The others trust me because I'm a police officer. You are a police officer. I am, he nodded. But I'm also a stranger. Lucy understood immediately. They're telling you what they think they should. Exactly. He rested both hands lightly upon the polished banister. They're choosing their words carefully. And you think they'd speak differently to me? I think they already have. Lucy leaned against the railing. What makes you say that? You notice people. So do you. I notice actions. Oliver looked at her. You notice meaning. Lucy couldn't help smiling. Arthur had reached almost exactly the same conclusion. What do you want me to do? Nothing official? He looked slightly uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to investigate. Good. Because I can't. You already are. Lucy laughed quietly. I know. Oliver smiled for the first time that evening. I was hoping you'd admit it. They stood together watching rain slide slowly down the great entrance window. Finally, Lucy spoke. Elliot. Oliver didn't appear surprised. I thought you might say that. Did something about him bother you? Not bother. Oliver chose the word carefully. Interest me. Lucy nodded. The photographs. Among other things. He took a notebook from his pocket. I asked everyone where they'd been this afternoon. I remember. Elliot told me he'd spent almost the entire time outside. Lucy frowned. So? Oliver looked towards her. Neil didn't see him. Neil was in the kitchen. Exactly. Lucy waited. The kitchen overlooks the eastern terraces. He paused. The same terraces Elliot claims he spent an hour photographing. Lucy considered that. Could Neil simply have missed him? Absolutely. Oliver slipped the notebook back into his pocket. I'm not accusing anyone. But whenever two accounts don't quite fit together, he looked towards Arthur's darkened study door at the far end of the gallery. I write it down. Lucy followed his gaze. The study remained closed. Oliver had locked it earlier. Somehow, the simple brass key hanging from his pocket now seemed enormously significant. You really think someone in this house killed Arthur? Oliver answered honestly. I think someone knows more than they've told us. There was no drama in his voice, no sensationalism, just quiet certainty. Lucy found that far more unsettling. They resumed walking, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. As they passed Amelia's portrait, Lucy stopped almost instinctively. Oliver followed her gaze. Arthur spoke about her often. He loved her. He did. Lucy studied the painted flower pressed between the pages of Amelia's book. I keep coming back here. Oliver looked at the portrait thoughtfully. I think everyone has. You too? He nodded once. I've been trying to understand why Arthur put her here. Lucy looked puzzled. What do you mean? Most families hang portraits in private rooms. He glanced around the entrance hall. Arthur wanted every guest to see Amelia the moment they entered the house. Lucy hadn't considered that. He was introducing her. Oliver smiled faintly. Exactly. The thought lingered between them. Not simply decorating the house, introducing someone Arthur desperately wanted them all to remember. Lucy stepped closer to the portrait. Something caught her eye. Very small, almost hidden by the frame. She frowned. What is it? Oliver joined her. At the bottom right corner of the painting, just beneath the artist's signature, tiny pencil initials had been written almost invisibly against the canvas. They weren't part of the original portrait. They looked added. Lucy leaned closer. C.H. Oliver frowned. Does that mean anything to you? Lucy slowly shook her head. No. Oliver looked back towards Arthur's study. I don't think Arthur added those. Neither of them noticed the movement behind them. Halfway along the upstairs corridor, someone quietly stepped back into the shadows, watching, waiting, before disappearing silently into the darkness. For several long seconds, neither Lucy nor Oliver spoke. The tiny initials beneath the portrait seemed almost absurdly insignificant when compared with everything else that had happened that day, yet both of them continued staring at the lower corner of the canvas, as though expecting the faded pencil marks to reveal something more. C.H., Lucy repeated quietly. It almost looks as though someone wanted to hide them. Oliver leaned closer, careful not to touch either the frame or the painting itself. They're definitely not part of the original signature. No, they're too recent. Lucy studied the lettering carefully. The graphite had faded slightly with age, but not enough to suggest it had been there for decades. Whoever had written the initials had done so lightly, almost as though they hadn't expected anyone to notice them in the first place. "What are you thinking?" Oliver asked. "I'm trying not to jump to conclusions." He smiled faintly. "That's usually a good start." Lucy folded her arms. "If Arthur noticed these, he never mentioned them." Or, Oliver looked thoughtfully at the portrait. "He intended to." The possibility settled quietly between them. Arthur had promised a presentation. He had gathered them together for a reason. Perhaps even something as small as 2 faded initials had formed part of the story he had intended to tell. Lucy reluctantly stepped away from the portrait. "We should leave it." Oliver nodded. "I'll mention it to the police tomorrow." He glanced once more at the initials before the two of them continued along the gallery. Neither noticed that one of the guest room doors, almost completely closed, shifted by the smallest fraction before becoming still again. Someone had been listening. The following morning arrived beneath another blanket of low cloud. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the early hours, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost unnatural after 2 days of relentless rain. Thin mist drifted lazily across the gardens, while droplets clung to every hedge and flowered like tiny pieces of glass. Lucy slept little. By the time she entered the breakfast room shortly after 8, Neil was already placing fresh coffee on the table. He looked older than he had the previous morning. Not dramatically, simply tired. His usually immaculate appearance had begun to slip. His shirt sleeves remained rolled neatly to the forearms, but his tie was absent and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that no amount of determination could disguise. "Morning," Lucy said gently. Neil managed a polite smile. "Good morning. You should have tried to rest." "I tried." He straightened a knife that had already been perfectly aligned. "I wasn't very successful." Lucy understood. Grief had a way of making even familiar routines feel unfamiliar. One by one, the remaining guests entered the room. Conversation proved hesitant at first, everyone instinctively lowering their voices as though Arthur might somehow still be sleeping elsewhere in the house. Andrew looked particularly subdued. His usual enthusiasm had disappeared entirely. Helen quietly thanked Neil for breakfast before taking her seat without another word. Marcus arrived last, carrying the same confidence as always, though Lucy noticed the confidence now felt forced. He smiled frequently, but never quite reached his eyes. Only Elliot appeared unchanged. He poured coffee, sat down, looked briefly through the rain-covered windows, then remained completely silent. Lucy found herself studying him again. It wasn't merely that he spoke very little. It was that he seemed almost detached from everything happening around him. Not cold, not uncaring, simply distant. Oliver entered moments later, carrying the notebook that had barely left his hand since Arthur's death. "I'd like everyone to stay together today." Marcus looked up. "Until the police arrive?" "Yes. It makes things simpler." Marcus sighed quietly, but offered no objection. Neil placed a basket of warm bread in the center of the table. "The tide should uncover the causeway shortly after 10. "So they won't be long," Andrew said hopefully. "No." Neil looked toward the window. If the roads remained clear. The reminder that weather still controlled their isolation seemed to dampen everyone's spirits once again. Breakfast had almost ended when Oliver placed his notebook on the table. "There is something I'd like to clarify." The room became immediately attentive. "It isn't an accusation." He looked around the table. "I simply want to understand yesterday more clearly." His eyes settled upon Elliot. "You mentioned spending most of the afternoon photographing the grounds." Elliot nodded once. "I did." Oliver reached into his pocket. "Would you mind showing us the photographs?" The request seemed perfectly reasonable. Even so, Lucy noticed Elliot hesitate. Only briefly. Then he removed the camera from the chair beside him and handed it across the table. Oliver accepted it carefully. "I won't touch anything unnecessarily." He began scrolling through the images. The first dozen showed exactly what Elliot had described. The gardens, rain collecting upon stone balustrades, the old chapel ruins disappearing into mist, close-up photographs of ivy climbing ancient walls, several striking images of waves crashing against the cliffs. Lucy almost smiled. The photographs were beautiful. Then Oliver stopped scrolling. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" Henry asked. Oliver didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the screen towards Elliot. "This photograph." Lucy leaned slightly to see. It was Arthur, standing alone beneath a cedar tree in the gardens. The image had clearly been taken only moments before the group continued their walk. Arthur wasn't looking at the camera. He was speaking to someone, only that someone had been cropped from the photograph. Oliver looked calmly at Elliot. "You told us you were alone." "I was." Oliver turned the camera back. "Then who was Arthur talking to?" Silence filled the room. Every pair of eyes settled upon Elliot. He looked at the photograph for several seconds before answering. "I don't know." Marcus frowned. "That's impossible." "He wasn't talking to me." Oliver remained perfectly calm. "The photograph suggests otherwise." "No." Elliot finally looked up. "It suggests someone stood there." Lucy watched him carefully. His breathing hadn't changed. His voice remained steady. He didn't appear frightened. If anything, he seemed confused. Oliver continued quietly. "Why crop the image?" "I didn't." "You didn't?" "It was already framed like that." Oliver studied the screen again. Lucy noticed something she hadn't seen before. Arthur wasn't smiling. He wasn't distressed either. He simply looked focused, as though listening intently to whoever stood just outside the frame. Oliver slowly handed the camera back. "I'm going to ask you something important." Elliot nodded. "Did you deliberately leave that person out of the photograph?" The question lingered. For the first time since arriving at Ravensmere House, Elliot Brooks appeared genuinely unsettled. "No." He spoke so quietly that Lucy almost missed the answer. "I didn't realize anyone else was there." Nobody around the table spoke, because every one of them understood exactly what that meant. If Elliot was telling the truth, then Arthur Pembroke had held a private conversation with someone in Ravensmere's gardens less than an hour before he died. And nobody knew who that person was.